After the Last Waltz, Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm had a falling out that has been described as one of music's longest-running feuds.
Before his death in August 2023, Robbie Robertson finally spoke about one of the longest and most painful feuds of his life, his fallout with Levon Helm. The two weren't just bandmates, they were central figures in the band, one of the most influential groups to rise out of the late 1960s and dominate the 1970s. For years, they shared the same stage, the same sound, and the same spotlight. Then, almost without warning, everything went sideways. What started as quiet tension grew into a decades-long rift that followed both men long after the band's peak and even after the Last Waltz in 1976. Before his passing, Robbie finally addressed what really caused the split, and what he revealed caught many people off guard. So what did Robbie Robertson actually say, and why did this feud never find closure? Let's get into all the details. Inside the band, the beginning of the slow-burning feud. The band gave us some of the most enduring songs of the 1970s, records that still sound lived-in, warm, and strangely honest decades later. But for all the music they gave the world, life inside the group was never as easy as it sounded on vinyl. The cracks didn't start at the end. They were already there, quietly forming, long before anyone called it a feud. By the time the final notes of the Last Waltz rang out in 1976, something had already shifted. Smiles were held a little too long. Conversations stopped short. And almost as soon as the curtain fell, everything came undone. What followed was a breakdown that would harden into a lifelong divide between Levon Helm and Robbie Robertson. But before the bitterness, before the blame, before decades of resentment set in, there was a very different story. It all began years earlier, far from sold-out arenas and farewell concerts. Before they were the band, they were the Hawks, a rough-around-the-edges backing group for rockabilly singer Ronnie Hawkins based out of Toronto. Levon Helm had been there the longest, joining up in 1957 and locking in as the full-time drummer after finishing high school in 1958. He made the long journey from Arkansas to Ontario, carrying Southern rhythm into cold Canadian clubs. One by one, others fell into place. Robbie Robertson, Rick Danko, Richard Manuel, and finally, Garth Hudson. For a time, Stan Celeste was also part of the picture. Hawkins ran a tight ship, and he knew exactly how to build a band. When promising musicians appeared on the scene, he didn't compete with them. He absorbed them. That's how Robertson, Danko, and Manuel came under his wing. Playing night after night around Toronto and Hamilton, Hawkins's act became a proving ground. Grueling schedules, no shortcuts. You learned fast, or you didn't last. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Hawkins, Helm, and Robertson became regular fixtures at Pop Ivy's Summer Garden Pavilion in Port Dover, Ontario. It was there in May 1961 that Hawkins spotted a 17-year-old Rick Danko playing at the pavilion and brought him into the fold. At that same venue, Hawkins and members of the Hawks caught their first glimpse of Richard Manuel performing with his band, the Rebels. That moment stuck. Before long, Hawkins was managing Manuel's group, and by September 1961, he convinced Manuel to leave and join the Hawks. Garth Hudson was the hardest to win over. Unlike the others, he had a college degree and a clear plan. He wanted to teach music, not chase club gigs. Rock and roll, to him, was a side interest. Still, the Hawks couldn't ignore what he brought to the table. His organ playing was explosive, fearless, and completely his own. After repeated asks, Hudson finally agreed to join, but only on his terms. Each member would pay him $10 a week for music instruction. They'd buy him a top-of-the-line Lowry organ, and all music theory questions would go through him. It wasn't arrogance, it was structure, and it slowly set a tone that would matter later. With Hawkins, they recorded a handful of singles and built a reputation as the tightest rock group in Toronto's thriving scene. Rehearsals didn't end when the club lights came up. Hawkins often demanded all-night sessions after long shows, pushing the band until their skills sharpened out of sheer necessity. But the control came with a cost. Over time, they grew restless. They were tired of playing the same songs. They wanted to write their own. And Hawkins's leadership style wore thin. He fined them for bringing girlfriends to shows, worried it would thin the crowd. Marijuana was strictly off-limits. The rules piled up. The freedom drained away. By late 1963, the break was inevitable. Personal differences finally split them from Hawkins, and for the first time they were on their own. They moved through names like they were trying on identities. First, the Levon Helm sextet briefly expanded with saxophonist Jerry Penfound. After Penfound left, they became Levon and the Hawks. In 1965, they released a single under the name The Canadian Squires, then circled back to Levon and the Hawks for a recording session with Atco later that year. Around the same time, they crossed paths with blues legend Sonny Boy Williamson and hoped to become his backing band. The plan never happened. Williamson died not long after they met. Then came the turning point. Later in 1965, Bob Dylan hired them as his backing band for his U.S. tour, followed by the infamous World Tour in 1966. After that storm passed, Dylan helped relocate them to Saugerties, New York, where they recorded the loose, intimate sessions that would become the Basement Tapes. Those recordings laid the groundwork for music from Big Pink in 1968. Locals around Woodstock referred to them simply as the band. Levon Helm later said the name just fit. It stuck. From 1968 onward, they were officially the band. Dylan would return to collaborate with them again, most notably on their joint 1974 tour. On the surface, it looked like success unfolding exactly as it should. But underneath, the balance inside the group was already shifting. Roles were changing. Lines were being drawn, quietly at first, and while the music kept flowing, so did the tension. It hadn't exploded yet, but it was there, waiting. To understand how that tension took root, you have to go back to the moment everything accelerated. Back to the year Bob Dylan decided to blow up his own image and drag a band into the fire with him. Inside the band's rise, fame, drugs, and the tension that changed everything. By late summer 1965, Bob Dylan was ready to tear his own image apart. The folk prophet was about to go electric, and he needed a band tough enough to take the heat with him. Not session players, not yes men, a real band. Levon and the Hawks came highly recommended. Blues singer John P. Hammond had already worked with Helm, Hudson, and Robertson earlier that year, and he knew exactly what they could do. Around the same time, a friend from Toronto, Mary Martin, who was working as secretary to Dylan's manager, Albert Grossman, pushed Dylan to see them play at a club on Yonge Street. Whether it was the Le Coq d'Or or the Friar's Tavern barely mattered. What mattered was her insistence. Dylan had to see these guys. Once he did, the decision came fast. After hearing them play and talking with Robbie Robertson, Dylan invited Helm and Robertson to join him as his backing band. But loyalty still mattered then. After just 2 shows, Helm and Robertson went back to Dylan and made something clear. They weren't leaving their band behind. If Dylan wanted them, he had to take all of them. Dylan agreed. At the time, it felt like the opportunity they'd been grinding toward for years. Wider exposure, bigger stages. They saw themselves as a disciplined rock and rhythm and blues unit, sharp and rehearsed. Dylan, to them, was still mostly the acoustic protest singer. What they didn't fully understand yet was how famous he'd become, or how ugly the backlash would be once the amps came on. From September 1965 through May 1966, they toured relentlessly. Night after night, Dylan stepped on stage electric, and the reaction was brutal. Folk purists booed, they heckled, they treated the band like accomplices to a crime. Dylan powered through, often chemically fueled, reportedly leaning hard on amphetamines to keep the pace. Some of the Hawks dipped into the same excess. Others watched it happen. Levon Helm couldn't take it. The hostility hit him deep. After just over a month, he walked away from the tour entirely. He didn't just step back, he vanished. While the rest of the band stayed on the road, Helm spent that time working on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico far removed from screaming crowds and electric controversy. It was the first major fracture, quiet but telling. Meanwhile, Dylan and the remaining Hawks tried to record between tours, but nothing flowed easily. Studio sessions dragged, songs stalled, progress was painfully slow. Eventually, frustration pushed Dylan to relocate the sessions from New York to Nashville, chasing momentum. In those sessions, Robbie Robertson's guitar cut through clearly. The others were mostly absent. No one called it favoritism yet, but the shape of things was starting to change. Then came Europe. In May 1966, Dylan and the Hawks took the stage at Manchester's Free Trade Hall. Near the end of the electric set, someone in the crowd shouted a single word that would echo for decades. "Judas!" Dylan paused, fired back that he didn't believe it, called the voice a liar, then turned to the band and told them to play it loud. What followed was raw, furious, and defiant. It wasn't just music anymore, it was confrontation. 2 months later, the entire machine stopped. On July 29, 1966, Dylan was injured in a motorcycle accident. Tours were canceled. The momentum evaporated. Dylan retreated into semi-seclusion in Woodstock, New York. The Hawks drifted back to bars and roadhouses, backing whoever needed them, trying to stay afloat. For a brief moment, everything felt uncertain again. Then Dylan called them back. In early 1967, he invited them to Woodstock. Several members rented a large pink house just outside town. They called it Big Pink. What happened there wasn't polished or planned. Songs emerged casually. Tapes rolled without pressure. It was loose, intimate, and quietly revolutionary. Helm wasn't there at first, but when he returned, his presence filled the room again. By the time those sessions wrapped in late 1967, the Hawks were done being anyone's backing band. They began writing seriously, shaping something of their own. They still didn't have a name. Stories differ on how it finally stuck. Some names were floated and shot down. Others were half-jokes. Eventually, they leaned into what everyone already called them. They became the band. When their debut arrived in 1968, it landed heavy. Critics raved. Musicians paid attention. The music sounded rooted, weathered, older than the era it came from. Success followed quickly. Tours, festivals, bigger rooms, louder praise. But success didn't settle evenly. As the spotlight grew, so did the imbalance inside the group. Robbie Robertson began taking on more control, more direction, more authority. To him, it felt necessary. The group, on the other hand, was unraveling in other ways. Drug use was creeping deeper. Reliability was slipping. Songs weren't coming from everyone anymore. Levon Helm saw it differently. To Helm, it felt like power tightening, like greed, like something being taken rather than shared. Accusations didn't explode yet, but they lingered, quiet, heavy, unspoken. Addiction hollowed parts of the band out from the inside, even as the outside world crowned them kings. They kept moving forward anyway. Albums came, tours followed, the music darkened. Anxiety crept into the lyrics. Fame didn't bring peace, it sharpened the edges. By the early 1970s, the band looked unstoppable from the outside. Inside, the tension was boiling. No one was backing down yet. No one was ready to admit how far things had shifted. But the fracture was there, and it was no longer subtle. That fracture didn't arrive in a single argument or a dramatic blow-up. It crept in slowly, carried by exhaustion, resentment, and a growing sense that the road was taking more than it gave. Fame hadn't unified them. It had magnified every difference. And eventually, someone had to decide where it all ended. That moment came quietly, then all at once. How the Last Waltz turned brother against brother. See. By the mid-1970s, Robbie Robertson was running on fumes. The road no longer felt romantic. Touring felt dangerous. After Northern Lights' Southern Cross failed to land the way they'd hoped, the band found themselves playing smaller rooms, secondary markets, theaters that made the contrast impossible to ignore. This wasn't the unstoppable rise anymore. This was survival. By 1976, much of the tour felt scaled down and strained, ending in places that spoke quietly but clearly about where the band now stood. The final stretch culminated in an opening slot for ZZ Top at the Nashville Fairgrounds, a moment that underlined just how much had shifted. Not long after, everything tilted further. In early September, Richard Manuel suffered a serious neck injury in a boating accident in Texas. It shook the group, but it also sharpened something that had already been brewing in Robertson's mind. Touring, to him, no longer felt sustainable. It felt reckless. He pushed the idea that the band should stop playing live, proposing a farewell concert that would close the chapter cleanly, at least cleanly on paper. What came next became legend. After a final television appearance in late October, the band staged the Last Waltz on Thanksgiving Day, 1976, at the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco. 5,000 people were served turkey dinners as the band took the stage. There was a horn section carefully arranged. There was an all-star lineup of guests, many of them woven into the band's story from the very beginning. Old mentors, old collaborators, old ghosts. Behind the scenes, the tone was less celebratory. The concert was filmed by Martin Scorsese, a close friend of Robertson's, and from the start, it carried a sense of finality that not everyone in the group had agreed to. To some, it felt like a farewell. To others, it felt like a decision already made for them. The year after, the band released Islands, an album that fulfilled their contract and cleared the way for the Last Waltz film and soundtrack to move forward. It was the final studio record by the original lineup. Around the same time, additional performances were recorded for the film, later folded into the footage along with interviews. By the time the documentary was released in 1978, The Last Waltz had been framed not just as a concert, but as a definitive ending. Levon Helm never accepted that framing. In his autobiography, Helm later laid out his belief that The Last Waltz had never been a collective decision. To him, it was Robbie Robertson's project, driven by Robertson's vision, executed on Robertson's terms. In Helm's view, the breakup had been forced, not agreed upon. Robertson never denied ownership of it. Years later, he acknowledged that he had made his statement through the film and the album, and that if others felt it hadn't been their statement, he was prepared to accept that. If it stood as his vision alone, he was fine with that. He believed the film spoke for itself and had no regrets about claiming it. Behind the grandeur of the farewell, the reality inside the band was rotting. Every member was struggling in one way or another. Drugs, alcohol, exhaustion. Trust was thin. Reliability was gone. Robertson later described watching their musical ability slip away in real time, feeling like he was standing inside something that was already burning and knowing he had to get out before it collapsed completely. The Last Waltz captured more than just the music. It captured the cost. The camera lingered long enough to show it. Hollowed faces, bodies pushed past their limits, hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. Richard Manuel's condition was impossible to miss. There were moments when he needed substances just to steady himself enough to get through a performance. Nothing was hidden. No one pretended it wasn't happening. It played out in full view, preserved forever on film. When the lights went down, the damage didn't fade. It hardened. After the film, the fractures inside the band didn't heal. They magnified. Whatever hope remained for a real reconciliation slipped quietly away. The original five did step on stage together one last time in March 1978, appearing after a Rick Danko solo show for an unannounced encore. It was brief, fragile, almost hesitant, no speeches, no declarations, just music, and then silence. And then it was over for good. What followed wasn't closure, it was loss. Richard Manuel died by suicide in 1986. Rick Danko followed years later, gone in 1999. The space between Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm never closed. Once inseparable, they barely spoke again after the breakup. Time passed, years stacked into decades. When Robertson looked back, he acknowledged that Helm's anger had always needed a target. If it wasn't the manager, the agent, or the lawyer, it eventually became him. The bitterness ran deep enough that Helm refused to attend Danko's funeral if Robertson was going to be there. That was how far things had gone. And yet, at the very end, something shifted. In 2012, as Helm's health failed, the two men finally met again. Robertson later shared that he traveled to New York and sat with Helm for a long while in the hospital. He reflected on the incredible, beautiful times they had shared, thinking about the music and the bond that once felt unbreakable. He described being warmly greeted by Helm's daughter, Amy, someone he had known since she was born. He expressed that Helm had always felt like an older brother to him, one of the most extraordinary talents he had ever known. He felt grateful for the chance to see him one last time, and made it clear that the love had never truly disappeared. Levon Helm died on April 19, 2012, at the age of 71, from complications related to throat cancer. Robbie Robertson followed more than a decade later. On August 9, 2023, he died in Los Angeles at the age of 80, after a year-long struggle with prostate cancer. In the end, there was no clean resolution. Just two men who made something immortal together, spent years unable to stand in the same room, and only found peace when there was almost no time left. Some feuds don't end loudly, they simply run out of life. Why Robbie Robertson refused to call it a feud with Levon Helm? For all the years they stood shoulder to shoulder, Robbie Robertson never accepted the idea that what defined his relationship with Levon Helm was a feud. Not really. Not in the neat, dramatic way people preferred to tell it later. The word stuck because it was convenient, because it flattened something complicated into something easier to digest. They had history, deep history, the kind that doesn't disappear just because things fall apart. Whenever Robertson was asked about Helm, he kept circling back to the same truth. In his mind, Helm was the closest thing he had ever known to a brother. Their bond wasn't limited to music. It spilled into everything. The personal and the creative were tangled together so tightly they became indistinguishable. Robertson believed that closeness was exactly why they were able to create something no one else ever quite matched. The music fed the friendship. The friendship fed the music. But because it all lived in the same confined space, it was fragile. Beautiful, but fragile. Even after everything unraveled, Robertson held that bond as something precious. From his perspective, there was never a feud in the traditional sense. He didn't see two men locked in open warfare. What he saw was Helm struggling, mentally, financially, personally. In the years after the band's peak, Robertson believed Helm slipped into patterns that made accountability difficult. Not out of cruelty, but out of habit. He felt Helm had trouble turning the mirror inward, and resentment had a way of finding somewhere else to land. To Robertson, a fight requires two people actively swinging. He never believed that was what was happening between them. Still, tension doesn't need mutual agreement to grow. Long before the money, the credits, and the bitterness, both men had already lived close to danger. Drugs were never a side note in their story. They were woven into the fabric of it. Early on, substances blurred judgment and bonded the group in reckless ways. Later, they hollowed things out. Reliability faded. Trust thinned. What once felt like shared rebellion slowly became a pressure point, especially as success magnified every weakness. That pressure didn't erupt all at once, it simmered. Robbie Robertson's life had always been marked by complexity. He was born Jamie Royal Robertson on July 5, 1943, to Rosemarie Dolly Chrysler, a woman of Cayuga and Mohawk heritage who had been raised on the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve near Hamilton, Ontario. She later lived in Toronto's Cabbagetown neighborhood, working at the Coro jewelry plating factory, where she met and married James Patrick Robertson in 1942. Together, they worked long hours, moving through several Toronto neighborhoods while raising their only child. As a boy, Robertson often traveled with his mother back to the Six Nations Reserve to visit family. It was there that music first took hold of him. His older cousin, Herb Mike, taught him guitar. The radio filled in the rest. Late nights listening to rhythm and blues drifting across borders, rock and roll bleeding through static, voices crackling in from Buffalo and Nashville. Those sounds didn't just entertain him, they made him. At 12 years old, everything shifted again, As his mother was divorcing James Robertson, she told Robbie the truth about his biological father. Alexander David Kligerman was a Jewish-American gambler she had been involved with before her marriage. He had died in a hit-and-run accident before Robbie was born. Soon after, she arranged for her son to meet his paternal uncles. They pulled him into their world quickly, making sure he felt like family. It was another layer added early. Another lesson in divided loyalties and complicated bonds. Those patterns didn't stay in childhood. They followed him into adulthood, shaping how he connected, how he committed, and how he guarded control. By the time Robertson entered adult life, relationships were never simple. Love and loyalty mattered deeply, but they often existed alongside distance, ambition, and an instinct to lead rather than yield. On March 24, 1968, at the height of the band's rise, he married Dominique Bourgeois, a Canadian journalist. Together, they built a family amid the chaos of fame, touring, and creative pressure. They had 2 daughters and a son, Sebastian. But the same forces that strained the band strained the marriage. Long stretches apart, creative obsession, and the weight of leadership took their toll. The marriage ended in divorce, another bond that couldn't survive the imbalance. Years later, Robertson found a different kind of partnership. After 4 years together, he married Canadian entrepreneur, restaurateur, and Top Chef Canada judge Janet Zuccarini on March 12, 2023. It was quieter, more private, less about momentum and more about grounding. Their marriage came late in his life, just 5 months before his death, but those close to him saw it as intentional. A man who had spent decades in motion, finally choosing stillness. Outside his personal relationships, Robertson committed himself to causes that reflected his values. He was involved with Artists Against Racism, using his platform to support anti-racism initiatives and public awareness campaigns. It was another expression of the same impulse that ran through his music and his leadership. When Robertson died on the morning of August 9, 2023, it sent shockwaves through the people closest to him. He had reportedly been battling prostate cancer for about a year, though his official cause of death was never publicly confirmed. Those close to him said he had seemed relatively well until the day before, when his wife took him to the hospital. He passed away surrounded by family, his wife, his former wife, his children. In May 2024, Robertson's 3 adult children filed a lawsuit against his wife, alleging elder abuse and undue influence. According to the suit, during a period of serious health decline, legal documents were signed that would financially benefit her after his death, allegedly without the full awareness or involvement of his children. Once again, the story turned toward control, trust, and who gets to speak when someone else no longer can. It was a familiar ending. The feud narrative survived because it was easier than the truth. The truth was slower, messier. 2 men bound by brotherhood, drugs, ambition, and silence. One who believed structure was the only way to keep everything from burning down. Another who felt that structure stole something essential. Neither completely wrong, neither completely right. They didn't destroy each other. They outlived the version of themselves that once fit together. And by the time the music finally stopped, there was no clean way back. What do you think about the feud between Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.